Welcome everybody, my name is Camila. I'm a developer advocate here at PlanetScale, and in this video I'm going to give you a step-by-step for how to set up PlanetScale and Prisma in a Next.js app. This video will be following a blog post that has already been published, so if you want to follow along with that, I will link it in this video description. In this video, we'll be spinning up a simple book application where users can suggest books via a form, and then we'll store those books in our database, and then I'll also be showing you how to read from that database so that we can see the books that have been suggested by different users and which are stored in our database. Now before we get started, I'm going to just talk a little bit about the technologies that we're going to be using to make sure that you understand what their role serves in this project. So firstly, what is PlanetScale? PlanetScale is a database as a service platform that is MySQL compatible. People love us because you can scale infinitely, and as a developer, you don't have to worry about a connection limit. Now, Prisma is an open source ORM that allows developers to write queries in TypeScript or JavaScript. And the reason people love Prisma is because you get to work with the relational database, with the SQL database, without having to write SQL. You can just write JavaScript or TypeScript code. Prisma offers 3 different products: Prisma Client, Prisma Migrate, and Prisma Studio. In this project, we're going to be using Prisma Client and Prisma Studio. Alright, so the first thing that we're going to do is go ahead and create a new database by heading over to PlanetScale.com. Here you'll either sign in or sign up. I already have an account. So once you're in, all you're going to do is hit Create New Database. Give it a name and region. Select the region that is physically closest to you. This is going to help to reduce any latency. So I'm in California, so I'm going to choose West, and we'll call this Bookstore. Another cool thing about PlanetScale is when you're using our GUI, it also tells you what the accompanying command would be if you wanted to run it using our CLI. So the first thing that you're going to do now is go ahead and initialize and create a new Next project, and you can do that by running this command npx create app at latest. Again, we're following step by step from the blog post, so all of these commands are typed there so that you can easily copy and paste. So it asks us if we want to proceed, and I'll call this Bookstore just so everything matches, and that's automatically going to create some boilerplate code for us so we can just get right into it. And now if we open this project in VS Code or any other code editor, you'll see here that we've been given some stuff to begin with. Inside of the pages folder, we have an API folder, an app.js page, and an index.js page. This is where the majority of our code is going to be. The next thing that we're going to do is go ahead and install Tailwind into our application. I just went ahead and Googled to show you how easy it is. All it says is that we need to run these 2 lines. So back in our terminal, let's cd, and cd means change directory. So let's move into the directory where our project is. Mine is called Bookstore, so I'll do cd Bookstore. Now I'm in the correct directory to paste this in. Boom. And while that is working its way up, we also see that we need to run this command, and let's go ahead and run that. And so when we run this project, index.js is the page that's actually being rendered. So if we want to show anything on the screen, we need to work inside of index.js. So as you see, this has a bunch of stuff that came when we created our project. We can go ahead and delete all this because we're going to be using our own thing. So now for this app, it's going to be a bookstore app where people can suggest different books that should be added to this bookstore database. Then in a different part of the app, you should be able to read from the database and maybe sort by category, sort by number of pages, and things like that. So the first thing we're going to do is just select everything from index.js and go ahead and delete it. We don't need to work with this for now. Now to make this quick and easy so that we don't have to worry too much about the UI and making this form look pretty, I'm just going to use something from Tailwind UI. I'm going to use a form. Now these are not free, these are paid, but if you are building this yourself, you can just go ahead and create your own form. For brevity in this video, I'm going to use a pre-made UI component. Okay, cool. So I'm going to use a contact section from Tailwind UI, as I mentioned, just to get this out of the way. So I'm just going to pick one that seems like it'll work best. So again, we just want our user to input like a book title, maybe the author, a category that it can be grouped with, and maybe one more field. So we don't need a whole lot. So maybe we can work with this. So here we select React because that's what we're working with, and if we toggle this, we'll get the code for this. So I can actually go ahead and hit copy, and if I go and paste this in my index.js file, this will show us this exact form. So now that I've copied that, if I go into my index.js file and I save this, now in order to use this, we need to install one more thing. We need to install Headless UI. So That's just a quick Google, and I know this because if you try to run this without it, you're going to get an error, and the error is going to tell you that you do need that package. So headless UI React is what the package is called. And here we see the package is found, and all we have to do is run this in our command line, similarly to how we installed Tailwind. So now we can head back to localhost and let's see what we get. Cool, so we see that we get exactly that form that we saw. This was already pre-built for us, but now we need to tailor this for our use case. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so I've already gone ahead and just changed this subline, but I'm just gonna change a few more things. So for example, we don't want the user's first name, but we can say book title, and then we'll just update this to be book title as well. Okay, now we're down to last name. So again, we don't need a user's last name, but we can suggest maybe the author name. And again, maybe here I can just search up last name and replace with author name. And we can just replace all of those like that. Boom. And now the other thing that I want to ask for is a genre, so that we can then group or search or filter by a specific genre so that we can read from our database. And instead of company, let's do genre. And then again, we can just look up company and do find and replace. So maybe we can just do genre everywhere. Genre, genre, genre. Cool. And now let's just save this and go back to our browser to see what it looks like now. So I'm going to switch back. Cool. So now if we see here, now it says book title, author name, genre. I changed this. I'm just going to change the last remaining bits and delete things that we don't need. Okay, so I've gone ahead and cleaned this up. I removed the fields that we didn't need, and now let's go back to our setup doc. The next thing that we need to do is go ahead and set up Prisma. And the way to do that is just by running this command in our terminal, and that will give us a .env file and all the files that we need for Prisma. So we need to copy this command and px Prisma in it and run it in our terminal. So you can just do this in the same terminal. I'm going to quit what's going on by doing Control-C and then just pasting that in, and it's going to ask us if we want to proceed. Just go ahead and hit yes. And now if we open our project back up in VS Code and we go to the files, we'll see that we have a newly created Prisma folder. Now the next thing that we're going to need to do is we're going to need to go to our .env file and update our database URL. Now the doc gives us the value that we need to set this to, so I'm just going to go ahead and do that. So if we head over to .env, you see here we have a database URL variable that has this strings. If we go over to our schema.prisma file in our Prisma folder, we see here that we have some stuff already predefined. I'm just going to copy and paste what is in the guide that I'm following. This will be exactly what you need to do as well. So I'm going to go ahead and just paste this in. And in our client, as our provider, we set Prisma Client JS. We added this preview feature, referential integrity, which I'll talk about in a second. And for our data source, we just went ahead and updated this as well. Now, the reason that we set that referential integrity property is because PlanetScale doesn't support foreign key constraints, and Prisma defaults to using foreign keys to express relations. So because PlanetScale does not support this, we need to go ahead and set this preview feature, referential integrity. And we see here from Prisma docs, referential integrity is a property of a data set that states that all of its references are valid. Referential integrity requires that if one record references another, then that reference record must exist. So now that we've done that, we need to define our schema. We need to define our data model. We need to tell our database, this is what you can expect. This is the type of each field that you can expect so that we can write to our database correctly. So let's think about ours for a second. For us, our users are going to be suggesting a book, which has a name of the title of the book, the author's name, and a genre. So we need to communicate that to our database schema to let them know what it is that we're expecting. With Prisma, we define these as models using the model keyword. And here we name our model. So I'm going to call this suggestion, maybe book suggestion. And we're going to open up our curly braces. Now the way to define these is first the field name and then the field type. So for the first one, it's going to be book title, and that's of type string. Next, we're going to need the book author. That's also of type string. And lastly, we're going to do our book genre, which is also string. Now, if you notice, it's still giving us a little error. And the error is that it wants us to have at least one unique field. For example, a book could have the same title. Many books could have the same author. Many books could be in the same genre. we need a specific field to be unique to every record. So an easy way for us to do that is to just add a field called ID, and the type is int, and we can use the ID attribute to define a single field ID on this specific model. We can also use the default attribute, and inside of the parentheses, we can also use auto increment. Now what this does is it creates a sequence of integers and assigns the increment values to the ID values. So basically all this is saying is like, hey, for each record that you store in this model, for each book, it needs a unique value. So for us, we can just use what Prisma offers us, the ID attribute, and then the default attribute where we can pass an auto increment. That way our user doesn't actually have to pass in an ID or a number every time. Prisma will automatically assign them one. All right, cool. So now that we have defined our schema and set up Prisma, we can go ahead and run our database locally. In order to do this, we can run this command in the terminal, and I will go ahead and run that. Now be sure to replace where it says your DB name here with your actual database name. So again, back in the terminal, I'll pull this in here and just enter. We'll see that the local address to connect our application is this. And this command will run a local proxy to your database, which will allow you a simpler way to connect your database when running your app locally. So in order to get our Prisma schema and our PlanetScale schema in sync, we can run this command npx prisma db push. And after we run this, we should get a success message letting us know that now our two schemas are in sync and we can start actually writing. So here we get that message. And now we can enter a MySQL shell and run any SQL commands by running this command here. Just be sure to replace Prisma Playground again with the name of your database. In my case, it's called Bookstore. So if we run this, now we are entering here where we can run describe and then the name of our model. And if we hit enter here, we'll see that the schema shows up. So we can see, cool, our schema that we defined in our Prisma file is here and it looks good to us. And I just realized I had a typo in my model. I spelled suggestion wrong. So I'm just going to go ahead and fix that. And with that, I'm going to need to push to make my two schemas go back in sync. So I'm just going to hit the up arrow a couple times until I see that. npx prisma push. Next thing that we want to do is we're going to promote our branch to production now that our schema is all figured out. And the way that we do that is by running this command. Again, you can do this in the same terminal that we're in. You just need to type the word exit and hit enter to exit out of this shell. And then I'm going to paste this in and change this to Bookstore because that's the name of my database. And what this is going to do is it's going to promote this branch to production so that it's ready. This means this is the schema that we want to go live. We're happy with this. Continue. So now that we see it's been successfully promoted, now here's the fun stuff. Now we have to create our API route, which is actually going to make the call to write to our database when a certain thing happens. Now that we've promoted our branch to a production branch, now we're ready to write our API route. Our API route is going to be what actually communicates with our front end and what actually is communicating with our database to do the writes and the reads. So let's see how to do that. So if we head over to the file inside of the pages folder, inside of the API folder, hello.js, we see that we're giving this code that comes with our Next.js project. So what we can do is we're going to go ahead and delete this, and I'm actually going to pull in the code from the blog post that we're following so I can show you how you can tailor this to your own needs. So let's just copy everything over and paste it and talk about this. So here in the blog post, I go step by step and I break down what each line of code does. So these first two lines of code, import Prisma Client, new Prisma Client, this is defining and instantiating our Prisma Client. And now we need to define the function that's going to get executed when somebody hits our API route. And that function is function handler. And this handler function is going to be what fields in the request and points the execution of the program depending on what the request method is. So for our program, we're going to be able to write to the database, but we're also going to be able to read to the database. So that means we're going to be using a post request method and a get request method. Depending on what the user passes in, we need to direct the execution of the program to perform a function based on what they're doing. So if they want to read from the database, we need to call a function that's different from if they wanted to write to the database. So that's what this is doing. So let's go ahead and edit this to make sense for what we want. So in here so far, we just have a way to handle the post method, and it's calling this function called create inquiry. So let's start by making sure that this handler function knows what to do if we get a get request. So let's just add an else if the request method equals get. Then we want to call a different function. So the function that we'd want to call is an asynchronous function that we'll call read books. And then pass in the request and the response object there. Now you'll notice in this function handler that we're passing in rec and rest, and that is shorthand for request and response. And when you're making a call to your API, you're sending in a request, and in turn, that API sends back a response. So that way we have access to both of these objects to work with them and read what is the request method, for example. And similarly, we can respond back to our front end, letting them know either it was successful or unsuccessful. So that's what we're doing here. And we have an else. If the request method is anything other than post or get, we're just going to return a status of 405 and a message letting the user know that this method is not allowed. So now we have to go ahead and define this. So we have this function called create inquiry, but we're not creating an inquiry, we're writing to our database. So we can call this function add book. And we can just go ahead and rename this add book. And here what we're doing is we're assigning the request body to a body variable so that we can kind of have access to it more easily rather than doing rec.body every single time we need the body. As you see here, we're going to be using it a few times. So this is just a shorthand. You don't need to do this. So wrapped in a try catch block, we're going to create a new entry. And instead of using inquiry, we need to reference the model in our Prisma schema. So if we go here, it's called book suggestion. And instead of inquiry, we're going to put book suggestion. But one thing to note is that although our schema model starts with a capital letter, when you're using it in your API route, you need to do camel case, meaning the first letter is lowercase and then any other word, that first letter can be uppercase. So in our case, it's going to be book suggestion. And here in the data object, we're going to define what it is that we're going to be passing to our database. So remember, the book suggestion model asks for a book title, a book author, and a book genre. So we can go here and say that. So we're going to say, hey, for the field book title, you're going to expect something called body.title. For the field called book author, you're going to expect something called in the body called author. And in the book genre field, you're going to expect something called book.genre. Now, I'm naming these variables, I'm naming these different so that you can differentiate what we're talking about. You could name these the same. I could name this book title, but then you might get confused as to which book title we're referencing. So for that reason, I'm just going to leave this as title. So then we say, okay, try this. If you're able to do this, that means it was successful. Send back a response of 200. And we're going to respond with that new entry and a success boolean of true. Now, if there is an error, we're going to console log that error and send back a code of 500, letting them know that there was an error in creating the book. Error adding book. There we go. So now similarly, we need to create a function to handle our get request. So I'm going to put that here and we can call this async function and we'll call this read book. We need to pass the request and the response object. And here we're going to do the exact same thing. So let's go ahead and assign the request body to a variable called body, just so that we can have easier access to it. And now that we have that, we're going to go ahead and add a try catch block. And we're going to do the exact same thing. So instead of writing, we're going to do a read. And the way that you read is we're going to set a variable called books equal to await prisma dot book suggestion dot find many, and this is going to return all of the books in this model. Now, if this is successful, we're going to return back to our client a status code of 200 because that means that everything worked. And then we're going to do .json, and what comes after this is what you're actually going to return to your front end. So we need to actually return the books that were fetched from this. So we're going to return here books because that's what we named this variable. If this was called all books, this would be called all books. And then we're going to also pass in our success boolean and set this to true. And similarly, if there's an error, we want to console log the error. And then we want to return a response status of 500, letting them know that there was an error. And instead of returning books, because there was an error, we're just going to return a message, an error saying error reading from database, and set our success boolean to false. Now, before we start trying to make calls to our API with the front end, we can test that our API is working as expected before we wire it up to the front end. And we can do this with an app like Insomnia or Postman or anything similar. I'm going to be using Insomnia, and I'm going to show you guys how we can use it. In Insomnia, you can just create a new request collection, and I'll call this Bookstore Video. And while you're in here, you can press this and hit New Request, and we'll just call this Bookstore. And here you can define what the request method you want to send in, and here's going to be our endpoint. In our terminal, if we run npm run dev, we can see that we're at HTTP localhost 3000, and the actual route for us is going to be /API/hello, because we're in the API folder and our file is called hello. So you can paste in that URL here, and it's going to look like this. And now you're ready to start making requests. So let's go ahead and do a post request to add stuff to our database. So for our body, you can go ahead and select JSON. Now here is where we're going to actually pass in our body. And remember, our body is where all of these properties and these fields that we want to save to our database are going to live. So let's switch back over here really quickly. So if we go here, remember, we're telling our function, hey, we're going to pass in a body, and inside of that body, there's going to be a field called title, author, genre, and this is actually from the code that we copied over, so let's delete that. So when we're using Insomnia to test our API, we have to make sure that the fields match exactly. So let's go over and write our body. So here in between two curly braces and object notation, we're going to do just that. So in quotes, this is very important, we're going to pass in title, and we'll call this Ocean's 11. I know that's a movie, but maybe it's a book too. Then we said we're going to pass in author, colon, Rihanna, colon, and then lastly, we said we were going to pass in genre. And this is going to be fiction. So now when we hit send, if we look at our code, when we run this, we're either going to get back a status of 200 and we're going to get back returned the entity that we just created, or if there's an error, we're going to get back a status code of 500 and an error message. So let's go back to Insomnia and just run this. So if we hit So if we go here and we hit send, oh, well, there was a typo in author, so let me fix that. Author, there we go. Now let's try that again. Perfect, so we got back the entity that we just created. We see it has an ID of 4. I tested this a few times off camera, so that's why the ID is 4 instead of 1. And we pass in the book title, the author, and the book genre. That means the function that we're using to handle the post request is taken care of. Now let's test get. So let's switch back over to VS Code. And when we're reading from our database, this should be read books. But when we're reading from our database, we're either going to get back a status code of 200 and the books that were read from the database, or a status code of 500 and again an error message. So you notice we're not sending in a body. We're not using this body anywhere. So we can delete this. And I added this on purpose to show you the difference between a get request and a post request. In a post, we're actually writing something to our database. Therefore, we need to pass in that stuff via the body. With a get, we're just reading from the database. There's no need to pass anything from the body. So in Insomnia, we have to make sure that there is no body. So let's head over to Insomnia. So what we can do is for the body, we're going to go no body. And instead of post, we're going to do get. Our endpoint is the same. And let's hit send. So now we see, perfect, we read from our database. We're getting all of the different entities, all the different books that were suggested. And that means now that our API routes are working. And now we can wire this up to our front end. So now back in our index.js file, if we see what's being rendered, again, it's this form. Now we want to think about, when should we write to our database, right? And for this example, we want to write to our database when the user submits the form by hitting the Let's Talk button. So we can go ahead and make that call to the API and tie it with that submit, with the submittal of the form. So let's go ahead and do that. So if we go back to VS Code, back in index.js, remember this is all stuff that came out of the box for Tailwind. Similarly, you would build your own front end, and I'm going to show you how to do the React logical stuff, how to do the business logic to actually make this call. So we see here that we already have use state, which is what we're going to need, which is one of the things we're going to need, so that's good. And we actually didn't end up using this, so that was annoying. So we see here that there is a state here that's not being used, and I can tell it's not being used because it's not a highlighted color. It's kind of a dull color. And it was probably for one of the fields that I deleted, so we can just go ahead and get rid of this. But we are going to need a state variable. So remember, the things that we want to capture is the book title, the author name, and the book genre. In order to store this, we can use state. So let's go ahead and create a state variable for each of these fields. So we can say const book title, set book title, and then equals use state, and what goes between these parentheses should be the default value. In this case, it should be an empty string. Now we're going to go ahead and repeat this for the other fields. Great, so now we're going to go into our form, and whenever the user changes the input, so whenever the user is actually writing in the form, we're just going to update that to save into state. And the way we can do that is by finding the input. So let's find the first input, which is book title. So I'm just going to do book title, so here. So in the input tag, we can actually add an onChange property, and what this is going to do is every time the input changes, we're going to call this function. So the function that we want to call is going to be to set the state. So in this case, this is what it would look like. It would look like this because there's an event, and we're going to do an arrow function, so an anonymous function that takes in the event, and we're going to do set book title, and the value of that is going to be e.target.value, and that just means, hey, take the value of what's actually in the input box. So now we have that, and we're just going to repeat this process with the 3 fields.
So I'm just going to even copy this whole thing. And we're going to look up book author.
Cool, so now we have all of this saved into state, and one way that we can verify is by using useEffect. So let's import that so we can use it. Cool, so now up here, what we can do just to double check that that's working as we expect, and in here, we're just going to console log these things. So we're going to console log book title and the actual variable book title. And we're just going to do the same for the rest of them. And the way that we're going to do this is we're going to set the dependency array to say, hey, anytime these variables change, I want you to run this useEffect hook and print this. So we're just going to add these 3 fields in here separated by commas, comma book author, and comma book genre. And again, what we're telling React is we're saying, hey, useEffect is something that triggers on the very first load and whenever something in the dependency array changes. So our dependency array, we're passing book title, book author, and book genre. Don't forget that comma. Because we want to say, hey, anytime the state gets updated, print out what's in the state. And again, we don't have to do this. This is just for our sake to make sure that everything's working how we expect it to work. So now let's go ahead and do that. So if we go back to our browser, and let's just open up the console so we can see our console log. And if we go to console, let's just clear everything that's here so we can focus on what's going on. Here, know my name. We see here that every time we type a letter, it's getting printed into the console. Same thing here, author, Jane Doe, and we see that it is getting updated, so that means our state is correct. And we're ready to go. So now that we know that we're correctly saving our state, now we need to write a function that actually makes the call to our API and passes in the book information that we need to pass in through the body. So I actually have that written in the blog post. So again, I'm just going to pull over everything from the blog post to make it really easy to show you guys how you can tailor this based on what's existing so you don't have to come up with everything from scratch. So we have this function called handle submit, which is going to be called when the user submits that form. And here we have event.prevent default, which just stops weird things from happening. So we're going to do that. And here we're defining what is in the body. Now, instead of all these things, we're going to pass in the things that we saved. But if we stop and think for a second, remember, we told our API, you're going to be expecting something called body, something in the body called title, author, and genre. And what we have now is book title, book author, and book genre. So this is not going to work for us. So we have to update our variable names to make sense. So we can either update in our index file or we can update our API route. But the point I want to make here is that you have to make sure that the name of these variables match up, or else it's not going to work. So what I'm going to do to make it easier so I don't have to change it in so many places is I'm going to update it in the API route to book title, book author, and book genre. Now, again, you could have just changed in your index file, I could have just changed this to title, author, and genre, but as you see, I've already written it in a few places and it was just easier to edit the other file. So now I'm going to save these new changes, and instead of passing in this stuff from the body, which is from the blog post, let's pass in the things that we want to pass in. So book title, book author, and book genre. And we're going to delete this. And in this function wrapped in a try catch block, we're going to say, hey, we're going to fetch this API route. So instead of inquiry, right, for us, it's called hello. And we should probably just go ahead and change this to something descriptive. So let's rename this. Let's rename this file, and we'll call this file, we'll just call this books actually. So if I save this to books, and then back in our index file, we're going to define what is the endpoint, right? So for us, it's API/books. And here we're going to use the method. So when the user is submitting a form, it's going to be a post request. We're going to leave this as is. This is copied over. This is going to help us with what we need to do. And for the body, we're going to json.stringify the body variable that we have up here. Now, we're going to say if the response is not 200, so if it's not a successful response, we're going to console log that something went wrong. Else, we're going to call this function reset form, which I'll talk about in a second. And then in the catch, it's just going to console log the error. Now, reset form is so that when the user presses enter, it automatically resets the form so that it doesn't have their information again, and maybe they accidentally submit again, and now you have two duplicates in your database. So instead of set first name, it's going to be set book title, set book author, and set book genre. And we'll delete this last one. And what we're going to do in our app is after a user submits a suggestion, we're going to display all of the suggestions that have been submitted, everything that's stored in our database. So in our handle submit function, in addition to actually making this request, we also want to read. Now we need to write a function that actually makes the call to the database to read from the database when we want to display all of the books that have already been suggested. We want to show all of the books that have already been suggested as soon as the user submits theirs. So once they submit theirs, we're going to show a list. So we can do that by creating a new function to read and then calling that function inside of this handle submit function. So we can call it maybe after reset form. So if this was successful, we're going to reset the form and we're going to display all of the books that have already been suggested. So let's start by defining our function just up here. We can call this const readdb, and again, this is going to be an asynchronous function, and this is going to be using the ES6 arrow notation. This is just a new way to write functions with this arrow. You can use the old way, it'll work exactly the same. So now inside of the function, very similar to the last one we did, we're going to do a try catch. And inside of the try, we're going to actually make the call to our database. So we can even just copy this and we're just going to change the method. So instead of post, this method is going to be get because we're reading from that database. These headers are going to stay the same. And we actually aren't going to pass in a body because when you're reading from the database, there's no information that we need to pass in. We're just saying, hey, get us everything that's in this database. So we can just remove this line. Now, when we make this request, our response is going to be saved in this variable called response. But we want to be able to actually display what's in here, right? So in order for us to be able to do this, we're going to introduce a new state variable to be able to store what we got back as a response from that request. So we can call this API response, and then here we do set API response, and the initial value for this is just going to be null. And remember, null is the intentional absence of value, so we'll be able to use this null value to check, hey, if there's anything in this response, then do this. If it's null, then do this. So that's why we're setting that initial to be null, so we can easily check if we have a response or not. So now that we have this, still inside of the try, right? Because if we are successful in making this call, we want to store the response into our state variable that we just created, API response. So we're going to do set API response, and we're going to do in parentheses await, and in parentheses we're going to do await, and then the name of our variable, which is response. And then we also need to do .json on this, just so that it is formatted correctly for us to be able to see. Now, again, really similarly to how we did here, we can even console log this and do our own thing. So if we get a certain response code, we want to do one thing, and if we get a successful response code, we want to do another thing. So still inside of this try, we can do it here after this has been set. We can just do, if the response is not 200, we'll console log that something's wrong. Else, if it is 200, that means it was successful. We don't need this. This is what we copied from the other one, and we can just console log a success message. Now, if there's an error, what we're going to do is console log the error, just like we did last time, and maybe just add a message to the user. There was an error reading from the database, and then a comma, and the actual error itself. Cool. So now we should be able to print out this state variable API response and double check that our response is actually there. So let's go ahead and do that by using useEffect. Again, we're using useEffect because anything that is in the body of useEffect is going to get re-triggered every time one of these variables changes. So now in addition to these, we also want to see API response, and we're going to log API response just to make sure that we are getting the response that we think we're getting. Cool. Okay, so now we've defined our function called readDB, which is actually going to be what makes the call to read from our database. But as you see, it's not really highlighted and it hasn't been read. If we hit this, it says readDB is declared, but its value is never read. So we've never actually called the function. A good place to call this would be after reset form, because we know, okay, cool, we've written to the database in handle submit. It was successful. We are clearing the form. So now we also want to call this function readDB. So make sure to spell it correctly and use the invocation parentheses. And now if we save this, we should be able to go into our browser and run this and see in the console that we're seeing all of the books that were in our database. So let's go ahead and do that. Cool, so I'm just going to refresh this and let's go ahead and try to submit something. And as we see here, to begin with, the API response is null. And remember, everything inside of useEffect is getting printed because everything in useEffect runs once on the first load, and then when anything else in the dependency array changes. So that's why it's showing us this to begin with. So let's start with of mice and men. Let's just say Stephen Harley, because I don't remember who the author of that is. And then for genre, let's add fiction. And now when we hit let's talk, we should see this value change. So let's go ahead. Cool, so we see our API response change. So now we have 24, and if we hit this down arrow, we can expand on each one and see we have all of these different books that I added while I was testing. So we're able to now write to our database and read from our database. So we have the two things down. Now, the last thing we need to do is be able to display the books. Instead of in the console, we want to actually show it to our user, right? Because this is not something our user would see unless they go into our console. And we're just doing this for testing. We're going to delete this. So it shouldn't even be in our console at the end of the project. So we were just making sure that our state variable was getting set correctly. And now we can confirm that it is. Let's go ahead and display this on the front end. Okay, so now that we've defined our function and we're actually calling the function inside of handle submit here, now we want to be able to actually render the books that we read from our database. So let's go down past this form and let's go down to the second to last div so that we're still in the main div, but we're kind of in our own section. We're going to open up a new div like this, and then inside this div, we're going to write some JavaScript by writing in between these two curly braces that lets us write JavaScript inside of this. So in order to display the books that we got from our response, we have to think about what our response looks like. So remember, our response is an array of objects. Each book has a book author, book genre, and book title properties. So the thing that we're going to do is we're going to say API response, and then we're going to do this optional chaining, question mark and period. It's basically to say if API response exists, if it's not null, then continue. And we need to do this because remember, on the first load, API response is going to be null. And if we do this without that optional chaining, we're going to get an error. So we say, hey, if you're null, don't worry about it. But if you're not null, then do this. So if you're not null, I want you to .map over the array and then two parentheses. And then we're going to give each item in this array a nickname. So remember, we have an array of books. Something fitting in here would be book. And it's just something for us as the developer to be able to remember what it is that we're working with. So book, and then we do the arrow notation again. And here we're going to tell it what to render. So inside of these two parentheses, we're going to render an LI, which again, you can render anything you want. This could be an H1, an H2. I'm just using an LI to get some bullet points. And inside of here, again, we're going to need some curly braces because we're going to write some more JavaScript. And we're going to display the book because that's what we referenced here. That's what we named it here. If we named this alligator, this would be called alligator, but we named it book. So book dot book title. And now if we hit save and we go over to our browser, we should be able to see that now when the user hits that submit button, it's going to see all of the different books that have already been written to the database. Now, it's not going to show on the first load because it's null, right? But as soon as we make that call and it's not null, we should see it populate, and that's going to happen when the user hits that submit button. So let me move myself out of the way, no, actually we're fine here. So I can actually close this console now. We don't need to look here anymore. And now let's just run this. I'm going to refresh just to make sure I have a clean page here. And let's do final works. This is by me, and it's called self-help genre. So now as soon as we hit let's talk, we should see this the part down here populate with all the different books. And we see, boom. That's exactly what happened. Let me turn the screen a little bit this way. And that's exactly what happened. Now we see all of the books. And as you can see, I had a lot of fun testing and playing around with this as I was working on it. But now our user can see all the books. Now, if you were actually working on this, you would probably want to format this a little nicer, but the logic is all here. The rest is up to you to style it to make it look how you want. And just like that, you've done it. You've created your own Next.js app using Prisma and PlanetScale. You can reach me on Twitter at CamiandThisThing to ask me any questions that you might have run into with this video, and I'll see you for the next one.